There is a moment in this case where the narrative breaks, not because something new is discovered, but because something expected isn't there. A criminal record. In cases like this, the public looks for patterns, past behavior, prior arrests, a history that explains the present. But when you look at Tommaso Cioni, that pattern doesn't exist. No criminal record, no prior arrests, no charges filed in any jurisdiction that have been publicly identified. On paper, he is exactly what he appears to be. A science teacher, a man who built a life, structured, stable, integrated. And that creates the first problem, because the type of crime being discussed in this case does not match the profile of a man with no history of criminal behavior. So the question is no longer, what kind of man is Tommaso? So the question becomes, what kind of crime is this? And what kind of structure would be required to carry it out? Let's start with something simple. Remove all names, remove all speculation, and look only at the structure. A targeted event. A narrow operational window. Possible interference with surveillance. A sequence that suggests timing, not randomness. This is not the anatomy of a spontaneous act. This is not chaos. This is not panic. This is coordination. And coordination introduces a second variable. More than one person. Not always, but often. Because crimes that involve planning, timing, and execution across multiple variables rarely exist in isolation. They require information, awareness, preparation, and, in many cases, division of roles. Which brings us back to the central contradiction. See, if Tommaso Cioni has no criminal history, no documented pattern, no visible trajectory toward this type of behavior, then how does he fit into a structure that appears to require more than one actor? Most discussions about this case have focused on a single point. Tommaso himself, his background, his behavior, his silence. But there is another question. One that has not been asked loudly enough. Not, what has Tommaso done? But, who is in Tommaso's world? Because when a crime exceeds the expected capacity of an individual, the investigation does not stop at the individual. It expands outward, into relationships, connections, networks, and proximity. To understand this, you have to build it from the beginning. Tommaso Cioni was born in Italy. He moved to the United States, established a life in Tucson, Arizona, became a science teacher, a profession that requires vetting, background checks, institutional approval. This is not a pathway that typically intersects with serious criminal behavior. He married, integrated into a family structure, participated in community life, music, creative projects, public spaces, social interaction. Everything about this profile suggests stability, not volatility, consistency, not escalation. And yet, he is now positioned at the center of a case that appears anything but ordinary. Early in the public conversation, there was an attempt to simplify the story. Financial pressure, debt, desperation. A narrative that is familiar, portable, easy to understand. But under scrutiny, that explanation begins to weaken. There is no verified evidence of financial collapse, no confirmed documentation of overwhelming debt, and no clear trigger that would explain a sudden transition from stability to extreme action. And when a simple motive collapses, the case becomes more complex, because now the explanation cannot be internal alone. It must involve something else, something external, something structural. Let's return to structure, not theory. Structure. If a crime involves targeting, then it involves selection. If it involves timing, then it involves knowledge. If it involves execution, then it involves planning. And if it involves planning, then it involves information, specific information, not general impressions, not guesses, details, the layout of a home, entry and exit points, security systems, daily routines, moments of vulnerability. This is not surface-level awareness. This is embedded knowledge, the kind that accumulates over time. In many cases, the most valuable part of a crime is not the act itself. It is the information that makes the act possible. Information reduces uncertainty. It lowers risk. It increases efficiency. And in some cases, it can be exchanged, sold, shared, transferred, which introduces a new layer. If information is required, then someone must possess it. And if someone possesses it, then the question becomes, how did they obtain it? There are only a few ways to obtain detailed knowledge about a private environment. Observation, repeated exposure, or trust. Observation has limits. You can watch a house, you can study patterns, but you cannot access everything from the outside. Certain details are invisible. They exist only inside conversations, inside routines, inside familiarity. And that is where trust becomes relevant. Because trust grants access. Not forced access, not illegal access, natural access, the kind that comes from being known, from being accepted, from being part of someone's life. Time changes everything. A short-term relationship reveals very little. A long-term relationship reveals more. But a relationship that spans over a decade, that creates something different. Familiarity without effort, knowledge without intent, understanding that builds passively, over years, through shared experiences, shared spaces, shared time. This is not investigation, this is absorption. And it is one of the most powerful forms of access that exists. This is where the structure begins to intersect with a name. Dominic Aaron Evans. Not a stranger, not a recent acquaintance, but a long-term associate. A bandmate. A co-founder of a project that dates back to 2007. That timeline matters. Not because it places this relationship far outside the immediate context of the case. This is not a connection formed under pressure or convenience. It is organic, sustained, embedded, over more than a decade. And relationships like that carry weight. Not because they imply anything, but because they create proximity. It is easy to underestimate what long-term proximity does. It is not just about knowing someone's name or their occupation. It is about exposure, repeated exposure. You meet their family, you learn their routines, you understand their environment. Not because you are trying to, but because you are present, again and again, over time. And eventually, that presence translates into knowledge. Not formal knowledge, not recorded knowledge, but lived knowledge. The kind that cannot be replicated quickly. When there is another layer that enters the conversation. Public records indicate that Dominic Evans has a criminal history, including burglary, robbery, theft, embezzlement. Each of these carries a different implication. Burglary involves unlawful entry, understanding how to access spaces. Robbery involves direct confrontation, interaction under pressure. Theft reflects repeated engagement with property-related offenses. And embezzlement is different. Because embezzlement is built on trust, you cannot embezzle from someone who does not trust you. It requires access, legitimate access, and then the decision to exploit that access. This is where precision matters. None of this establishes involvement. None of this proves participation. There is no public evidence linking Dominic Evans to the crime. No charge. No official designation as a suspect. And that distinction is critical. Because what we are examining is not guilt. It is structure, patterns, overlap, the intersection between proximity, access, and experience. When you place these elements side by side, something becomes visible. A crime that appears to require planning, information, access, and potentially multiple roles. A central figure with no criminal record, no established pattern, and then, within that individual's extended world, a long-term associate with documented experience in accessing structures, exploiting trust, engaging in property-related crime. This is not a conclusion, but it is not random either. It is an alignment. In real investigations, this is where questions begin, not end. Questions like, who had access to relevant information? Who had long-term proximity? Who had the capacity to understand the environment? Who had experience that could translate into execution? These are not accusations. They are filters, used to narrow a field, not to define guilt. Every crime exists within a perimeter, sometimes small, sometimes large, but rarely isolated. Even when a single person carries out an act, that person often exists within a network of knowledge, of relationships, of influence, and understanding that network is often the key to understanding the crime. There is another element in this case: silence. Tommaso has maintained minimal public communication, which is his legal right. Silence does not imply guilt, but it does remove information. And when information is removed, interpretation increases, questions expand, and the absence of explanation becomes part of the narrative. At this stage, the case contains more structure than resolution. We have a central figure without a criminal record, a crime that appears to require planning, a possible need for detailed information, a trust perimeter, a long-term associate with a relevant criminal history, and yet, no confirmed explanation, no completed narrative, no public answer. This is where everything must remain grounded, because the distance between possibility and proof is significant. Possibility raises questions, proof answers them, and until evidence crosses that gap, everything remains in the realm of analysis, not conclusion. So we return to the beginning, not to repeat it, but to refine it. A man with no criminal record, at the center of a case that appears structured, planned, coordinated. And the question is no longer simple. It is layered, and not just, what happened? But, what combination of people, access, and information made it possible? Every case has an edge, a boundary where the known ends and the unknown begins. And somewhere along that edge are the answers, not always visible, not always spoken, but present, within the network, within the relationships, within the structure that surrounds the event. Tommaso is at the center, but no center exists without a surrounding. And until that surrounding is fully understood, this case remains incomplete.